if, when you're taking the class, we haven't addressed the Dred Scott decision previously, let's do it right here. So the key term related to this is Roger Taney and Dred Scott. And just a heads up, although I know you're on top of it, your notes on this key term begin back in the last lecture when we talked about Roger Taney as a young lawyer out in Western Maryland. And you remember he defended that preacher from Pennsylvania, Jacob Gruber, the one who came down to Western Maryland and said that slavery was a galling sign of America's hypocrisy, and then got arrested for inciting insurrection. And remember that Taney took his case and argued that slavery was a blot on America's national character. He had freed his own slaves as a young man and was part of the Maryland State Colonization Society, which, remember, although reasonably seen as reprehensible today, the white folks who were in the Maryland State Colonization Society generally thought of themselves as better allies of black people than most white people were. In their own minds, they were trying to help. Then, remember, we spent some time with Taney as an Andrew Jackson supporter, and that's where he made his big political ascent, right? Serving Jackson in various positions and ultimately getting appointed as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which is where we find him now in the 1850s, still in that same position where he's been since the Jackson administration, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And the case of Dred Scott made its way to the Supreme Court at this point. There are a lot of police sirens as I make this video, and I don't know if they're coming through on the recording or not. If they are, I just want you to know that I think I can finish the video before they come to get me. Okay, so the Dred Scott case comes to the Supreme Court, 1850s, when Taney's Chief Justice, and the case is about this enslaved man who thinks he's not enslaved anymore. His name was Dred Scott, and he had been enslaved out in the slave state of Missouri, but his master was actually a doctor working for the U.S. Army, and he brought Dred Scott with him during his service. And this meant that Dred Scott spent lots of time out in the Western territories, which had been made free by the Missouri Compromise. You remember the Missouri Compromise, right? Back in 1820, that created all that territory from the Louisiana Purchase where slavery wasn't permitted. That was by law, according to the federal government. And yet, Dred Scott's master brought him out to those western territories, held him as a slave there for years. Eventually, Dred Scott got help from a sympathetic lawyer and sued his master, arguing that he and his wife should be free. Then the core of the legal argument is that Dred Scott and his wife Harriet should be free because they were illegally held in territories where the federal government said slavery was illegal. Now, for Dred Scott, this was a long, tangled legal case. It was first in state courts in Missouri, then it moved to the federal courts. At points along the way, he won. but then his master appealed and the case continued. His original master died during the legal proceedings and he winds up suing his new master. Okay, so we don't need any more detail on all that. It's a mess. And it eventually gets to the court. But at this point, there were 5 slaveholders on the Supreme Court. 9 justices in total, 5 of them slaveholders. So the majority of the Supreme Court are slaveholders. At this point, 7% of Americans were slaveholders. That's it. Because it's 0% of Northerners, right? And it's about 25% of Southerners. That comes out to right about 7% of Americans who own slaves. And yet, slaveholders are the majority of this powerful institution, the Supreme Court. Tawney wanted to use this decision to, the way I read it in his own mind, he wanted to use this decision to save the Union, to prevent a civil war, which he believed could be on the way. He hoped to destroy the Republican Party. He believed that the Republican Party was a tool of the abolitionists. Now, if you were an abolitionist, you would say the Republican Party is definitely not abolitionist. Abolitionists believed slavery was immoral, wrong, sinful even. The Republicans said, for political reasons, we want to stop the spread of slavery. Not that they wanted to end it, just that they wanted to keep it from spreading out to the western territories that the U.S. had acquired from the Mexican War. Okay, so to most slaveholders, the Republicans are the same as the abolitionists. But if you're an abolitionist, you would say, absolutely not. Those Republicans, they're kind of gross politicians. I'm a moral activist. Okay, but Tawney wrote the decision for the court. And the decision was 7-2 among the justices on the court. That means 2 of the 4 non-slaveholders voted with the 5 slaveholders on the court. The court ruled that the Missouri Compromise line, that was the line made back in 1820. We just spent a few minutes on this, but I know you remember everything, where Congress drew a line through the Louisiana Purchase territory and said, hey, slavery is not allowed above that line. And remember, that was the whole basis of Dred Scott's legal case. Well, Tawney and the court said that the Missouri Compromise line was unconstitutional. That it was unconstitutional. That Congress had no power to do what they did. Congress had no power to restrict slavery in the territories. Because the Missouri Compromise line was unconstitutional, it was void, of no force, according to the court, and so Dred Scott had no legal claim. So Dred Scott will remain a slave. Later, abolitionists raised money and purchased freedom for him and his wife. But according to the court decision, right, no freedom. But Tawney wasn't done. Again, he believed that the abolitionists were the one bringing on a conflict that was going to turn the nation against itself. Really, it's like he thinks there's a bunch of stupid liberal activists who are going to drive white people to fight other white people over this silly issue of slavery and, racial equality. And remember, the Republicans, their whole political appeal was, vote for us, and we're going to stop the spread of slavery out west. Well, the Supreme Court has just ruled you can't stop it. The federal government cannot stop the spread of slavery. And this is how he hoped the decision would destroy the Republican Party. But the court went even further. The court said that free black people were not citizens of the United States. That they were not citizens of the U.S., and they never had been, and they never could be. According to Tawney, quoting here, the Negro had no rights which any white man was bound to respect. It was a devastating denial of political rights and citizenship, which, again, this part's not about slaves, right? It's about free black people. At this time, there were close to 500,000 free black people in the United States. And, as we've seen, there have been these efforts in Maryland and around the country to drive free black people out. And free black people have responded, for the most part, by saying, no, I'm a citizen of this country too. You can't make me leave it. And now, the Supreme Court has said, actually, you're not. You're not citizens of the U.S., you never have been, and you can't be. So you see, Tawney thought that he was settling the arguments. That the Supreme Court would be the part of the government that would save the Union by giving clear answers on these questions related to free black people and to slavery itself. And so, there never was a civil war. Wait, don't write that part down. Don't write that part down. That's not true. It didn't work out the way that Tawney envisioned. Instead, across the northern states, the Dred Scott decision actually convinced a lot of white voters to vote Republican. It felt like the only way to stop these slaveholders from always getting their way and doing whatever they want is to go vote Republican. It's part of what fueled the collapse of the Know-Nothing Party nationally, is that those voters who, remember, were kind of torn between Republicans or Know-Nothings up north, they now went streaming to the Republican Party. There were northern states, the state governments, who said, we will not obey this Supreme Court decision. The state of Massachusetts actually declared that they had nullified the court's decision. And of course, this allows southern states to say things like, oh my goodness, how can we stay in a country with a state like Massachusetts? Why, if they don't respect the Constitution, then whatever are we going to do? Heavens to Betsy! So, the decision, meant to settle the conflict, wound up fueling the conflict and making it worse in ways that we'll see continue as we move through these events of the next few years.